Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Pandemic Diaries with Kaylee Day. I'd like to kick it off by giving a big shout out to my dad for doing the sound mixing. He is so talented and has really been a key player in helping me get through the slump of this last year. And today, what I really want to talk about is my experience with the COVID-19 pandemic as a student, as a part of the workforce, and as a family member. And then I also wanted to delve a little bit deeper into the art and the media that I was consuming that helped me get through it, that was extremely relatable and entertaining. And I hope that y'all decided to stick around. We're coming out of it a little bit worse for the wear, but I think a whole lot stronger. I just got my second vaccination, and I'm feeling great, and I hope that everyone is too. So, as some of you may know, I am currently a senior at CSU Bakersfield, and at the time that the pandemic hit, I was a junior, and I think we had maybe a couple months left in school. I had just transferred that fall from Taft College, and I was loving my on campus experience. I had made so many great friends and had a lot of really great campus resources that I was utilizing. Um, Prior to the pandemic hitting. And to be 100% honest, I never imagined that the pandemic would be what it is today and what it has been for the past year. I distinctly remember watching, MSNBC with my father around dinner time, in the months prior, and learning about what was happening in Wuhan, and really thinking, oh my goodness, like that's so tragic. I hope that they are going to recoup. But I never really considered that it would ever move here. I thought it would be, similar to the, Ebola outbreak, or similar to the H1N1 swine flu. I just didn't think that it would be so prevalent in my day-to-day life. And I assume that that really comes from a place of privilege. And so this has been extremely eye-opening. But I remember distinctly the first day that CSU Bakersfield decided, okay, we're shutting it down. We are moving to online instruction until we can determine that it is safe for everyone to come back. And I believe it was a Thursday afternoon, because I was in my history of the language class with Professor Ajay, and as many people do, we take dictation on our laptops of our lectures, and I remember hearing a bunch of ping, ping, ping. Everyone was getting email notifications, and finally our professor stopped what she was doing and shared her screen to show us all that the dean, President Zelensky, had decided that we would be going to online education until it was safe. And at the time, it was only maybe a couple weeks prior to the planned spring break. And I remember thinking, oh, fantastic, spring break's going to be like a month now. And I had a friend, Emilio, who was going to be doing some international travel. He had planned a trip to Italy with his sister. And he was freaking out. He was telling me, Kaylee, I don't know how we're going to do this. I don't know if we're going to have to reschedule, if there's going to be any refunds. And I remember looking at him and thinking, like, Emilio, it's going to be fine. Like, don't worry. Your trip will not be canceled. And my other friend, Patrick, had the same look on his face. He seemed completely unfazed. And that was just the consensus, I think, at the time. It was very much just, okay, this will be fine. We will be okay. Give it, a month or two, and we'll have this under control, whatever it is. And, cut to not even maybe 2-3 weeks later, beginning of April, and we have a full mask mandate. Everyone is getting complete lockdown orders. All the jobs are switching over to home. And it was really overwhelming at first. And I remember distinctly just thinking, okay, well, this won't last very long. And obviously we are here a year later. So as far as academics go, I am confident in saying now that my online education has been honestly very positive. I think a lot of the professors that I've been lucky enough to have been very accommodating. They've been willing to work one-on-one. They have online office hours. And I think that overall it's made me a lot more communicative with people in the campus community. I think that overall being online has opened me up to a lot of people that maybe otherwise I would not have been in contact with as closely as I am now. But obviously, it has been interesting as someone who is eager to work in a classroom setting. Um, when I was in the fall, I was doing a tutoring course where I had to complete 45 hours with students via Zoom. And that was honestly a very great privilege. I thought it was very fun. And I think a lot of the kids were pretty active and interested in getting feedback from you because maybe they hadn't been getting it as much because of the pandemic. So I felt really fortunate to be able to talk to those high schoolers and help them along as they are adjusting as well. And so overall, I would say that my academic career has been inventive, creative to say the least. But I don't think that I feel like I have been robbed of anything. I don't think that I truly felt like I missed out on anything. I will say that this is the finals season, and I do miss being locked away in the Walter Stern Library. But overall, I think that everyone's adjusted fairly decently, and I think that everyone is still just as excited about their time at CSU Bakersfield. And I do look forward to this next fall. They will be having hybrid courses, and I'm hoping that for my teaching credential, I will still be able to be in class and shadowing teachers actively. Whether that means full time or part time, I am completely ready for whatever this throws at me. And yeah, I still feel very fortunate to be on a campus and in a community that is just so invested in my success. And obviously, as I addressed, I do want to speak a little bit more about what it was like being in the workforce during the pandemic. I think that was one of the most strange adjustments that I had to make. And I will start by kind of acknowledging that my experience as someone in the workforce during the COVID-19 pandemic is not really what I would consider to be quote unquote normal. I had been working from home prior to. I was working for a company doing billing, and all of the things that I would do with their software was from home. And so, honestly, for myself, I don't think that I really felt the full effects of the pandemic right at the beginning, just because I was so already adjusted to doing work that way. I had plenty of friends my age who, worked in retail or worked in food service. I actually have a friend of mine who worked at Magic Mountain. And so their jobs completely closed down. At least for myself, my job kind of kept me afloat and kept my sanity for a little bit longer. So for myself, I didn't really feel the effects of the pandemic till quite a bit later. And I believe it was July 31st. So my job that I was doing at the time was attached to oil. And as a lot of people know, during the pandemic, people were not obviously not driving a lot of places. They weren't traveling. People weren't doing any type of international travel. And so oil became a lot less of a hot commodity. And so I want to say in June, some of our workers were furloughed. And then for myself and the rest of the office staff, we would continue on with a little bit of shortened hours, and so it wasn't super dramatic for me at first. And then on that 31st, the July 31st, it was a Friday, I got called to speak to HR, and I had no clue what it was about, although I did have a hunch. And I was informed that I was being laid off from my job. And while I think I did see like the writing on the walls, it was a big shift for myself. Luckily, I had already been back home, so there was no risk of me being displaced in any way. But for many people, that was the case. And immediately I was thrown into this big pit of fear, honestly. And I'm 23. I've never had to navigate filing for unemployment. I've never had to kind of scramble in that way. And I was really aware of the privilege that I had to not have to wonder, where am I getting my next meal from? How am I going to pay rent? How am I going to, feed my family? Um, and that was something that a lot of people at the time were constantly having to wade through every day. And I cannot imagine the fear that that brings up in someone's life. Um, but for myself, I remember filing for unemployment the next Monday and having no clue how to do any of the paperwork. And this isn't really something that anything prepares you for. And I remember calling up my friend Matthew, who had just filled out his, and having to have him kind of walk me through it, as well as my old coworker, Carlita, because I was just so lost and so scared of potentially, committing perjury on any government forms. I look back and that's very funny to me because at the time I really couldn't see the humor in it. Um, and so for myself, this was the kind of catapult into doing a lot of things that I did need to do, however, and so that was very positive. I finally completed my CBEST exam and I began registering to become a substitute teacher. And so that was really great. I think in a lot of ways I was very lucky to be able to kind of start that process and have some good time for myself and good time to adjust mentally to the world around me that I had kind of been pushing off and kind of pretending wasn't really there. Um, and so I remember that at the time I had all this free time, and I think everyone by that point in July had kind of adjusted. Everyone was doing puzzles and making bread and making soap and doing all this fun stuff that I really had never thrown myself into. And so for myself, I remember my idea was that I was just going to reread a lot of books, or I was going to pick up some new books that I hadn't read. And obviously, as an English major, I'm going to talk about them because they mean a lot to me. And I think that was my number one coping mechanism was allowing myself to have this free time that I really hadn't done in a long time, and also just knowing that at some point in history or at some point in time other people had maybe felt the isolation and the fear and the loneliness that I was feeling at the time, along with the uncertainty. And luckily, I've landed on my feet. I unfortunately, in some ways, did have to go back to retail, but I am very happy with where I'm at, and I'm looking forward to this next chapter. I begin my credential program in the fall and I'm very excited. And so overall, yeah, I appreciate that the pandemic did make me slow down a little bit and really realize what I value and what is important to me. Whether that be, my own personal goals or the people in my life as well. One of the most important portions of the pandemic and how I relate to other people is as a family member, is as someone who has lost loved ones due to this pandemic, and really just learning to always be empathetic to other people. So now here comes the moment that I've been waiting for, at least, and that's to get a little time to talk about the books that I was rereading during the pandemic. And so for myself, one of the books that I decided to pick up and really look at again was The Shining by Stephen King. And I know that it is presented in movie form, at least, as very kind of brash and frightening. Obviously, it's been one of my favorite horror films since I can remember. I think the first time that I watched it, I was maybe 9 going on 10, which sounds terrible. Please don't tell my mother that I shared this with you. She she would kill me. Um, and yeah, it's been such a big part of my life and so much of my fascination with horror films and fascination with movies, honestly. I think some of my favorite films are psychological thrillers and horror, quote unquote. And I think that this movie also just kind of rides the line really well. And I think that a lot of Stephen King's work does. And so this is something that I really wanted to talk about because it follows such a normal family going through something that I think so many of us have, and obviously it's a lot more heightened, it's a lot more fantastical. and it involves ghosts in a scary inn, but I think that there's a lot of commonality there to look at. So, to begin this segment of the podcast, I thought it'd be really helpful for anyone who has maybe never watched the film or never read the book to kind of give a brief overlook as to what the novel contains and the characters and what kind of forces that they're kind of up against. So, to begin, we start with Jack Torrance, who is the father of the family. Jack is a recovering alcoholic. He's an aspiring writer, and prior to the novel's beginning, you see Jack has a very big anger problem. He has a 5-year-old son, Danny, whose arm he has accidentally broken. He was also a teacher, and he was fired because he assaulted a student. And so we know that right off the bat, Jack has got a lot of demons that he's dealing with, and he doesn't really quite know how to approach those relationships. Because he is dealing with so much stuff in his own life. And then the counterpart to Jack is Wendy, his wife. She seems like a very typical, like loving, caring wife. She is standing by her husband despite all of his shortcomings, and it's very touching to see that dynamic. And she's just a very strong woman in her own right. We see her throughout the novel doing a lot of the heavy lifting, quote unquote, um, both physically in terms of just the labor division, and then also emotionally. Emotionally, she does a lot in this book, and she is a vehicle for a lot of resentment for Jack, because I recognize that she really does see him, and she knows exactly who he is, and I think he is maybe not fully comfortable with that. And then we move on to the third member of their family. That's Danny. He is a 5-year-old. He is their son, and you know pretty quickly that he has these psychic abilities, and that is where the novel gets its name, The Shining, because that is what they call it. They call it The Shining. And that kind of allows him to like read people's minds. He is someone that has some premonitions. He's clairvoyant, I guess you could say. And so essentially, when the novel begins, Jack has taken a position at this hotel in the Colorado Rockies called the Overlook, and it's considered to be pretty historic. And basically, in the winter, there is an off season because it just would cost so much to keep it running because no one's in the Rockies. So they are kind of kept in, and they are told prior to Jack receiving the job that there was another caretaker. His name was Delbert, and he's told that that family succumbed to cabin fever, and Delbert killed his family. And they basically just ask Jack, do you think this is an issue? Do you think this would be a problem? And him, in all his hubris, I guess, just doesn't really necessarily know this. That this is something that he might be prone to. I think in a lot of ways in the book, we see Jack hoping that, this seclusion, this proximity to one another will really help us heal from what we've been going through. And so that's essentially the onus of the story. And as the story moves forward, we see that Danny is able to see ghosts and these visions, and so we know pretty quickly that the hotel is haunted and that the family is in for quite a rude awakening. And as off as it sounds, I think for myself, and I think for a lot of people, we embody qualities of Jack and Wendy. Although their relationship is quite tumultuous, they are both just people who are struggling at the end of the day. They're working class. They don't really have a safety net. I think that's something a lot of us found out during the pandemic. A lot of people were displaced from their homes. A lot of people had to worry about whether or not they were going to be evicted. They had to worry about how they're going to get the money to take care of their children. And that was very frightening. And I think a lot of us also realized that the government wasn't really that big of a source of a safety net. They, you know, It's very scary to feel like you're just working extra hard to keep your head above water and the people that are supposed to be taking care of you really are not. And also, I think in terms of Jack's character, a lot of us had a moment of realization that maybe we did have some problems, much like his alcoholism, that maybe we weren't addressing because we were able to, in the day-to-day grind of life, push aside our problems and being able to stop and look at and take stock of our lives, we realize, wow, maybe I'm unfulfilled professionally, or maybe there's mental health issues that I'm not really addressing, or maybe my relationship with my family is not where I want it to be. One of my favorite songs is by Regina Spektor, and she says, taking steps is easy, standing still is hard. And I think that that's something that is reflected heavily in this novel and also reflected in our day-to-day lives as people going through a quarantine where we are shut in with our houses, with our families, and with ourselves. And then I think on the flip side, a lot of us can identify with being Wendy. I think throughout this novel, she's just trying so hard to keep things together. She's trying to juggle being a mother, being a wife, being someone who is working all the time. And I think that that's something that we can all agree that we felt through the pandemic was we were just barely keeping things together, trying to fulfill all of our obligations at once while being burnt out ourselves and just trying to be everything for everyone all at once. And so I really appreciate their characters in that way. They are very profoundly flawed, both of them in their own way, yet they really do try to love one another, and ultimately not addressing those issues that they're going through is what leads to their demise and their deaths. And I also want to talk about the boiler room as this very interesting metaphor, and also just the Overlook Hotel as a metaphor. Um, I think in a lot of circumstances, especially mental health ones, which is one thing that I think this book highlights so lovely, and also just like domestic abuse and perhaps domestic violence as well is something that's a really big theme in this book. Um, and so I think the boiler room is a great metaphor. It's noted pretty early on by the hotel manager that they have to keep tending to the boiler room, or else it will ultimately explode, and that is how everyone ends up dying in the end of this novel. After Jack has murdered both Wendy and Danny. Um, and so that's really interesting. I think that is a great metaphor for people who maybe are not tending to that maintenance care of themselves, ultimately are the ones that end up kind of cracking under pressure or exploding mentally, physically, emotionally, whatever way you want to look at it. And then also the Overlook Hotel, I think for myself, at least during this pandemic, was a really great metaphor for those safety nets and for those entities that maybe should be caring for us a little bit better, whether that be the American health system or just the government in general. We see in this novel that the approach is so odd because, at the time of him being hired, Jack is being told that Delbert has killed himself due to the conditions and due to the cabin fever. But there's really no approach by the hotel or the hotel's management to change the procedures, the practices that they have. They're just asking Jack, do you think that that's something that you can handle? And I think that that is, in many ways, what has been happening with a lot of people in America. Is this something that you can handle? Well, if you can't handle it, then that's not our problem. And I think that that is the way that the government has approached a lot of their aid and relief. Many of us know we've only been given so many stimulus checks, and they're very few and far between. And it feels, in many ways, like maybe we have just been hung out to dry. And it's very sad. It's very unfortunate. And I think that. Unfortunately, some people have not been able to address the issues going on with themselves because of the daily grind and the way that larger corporations and government entities have been taking advantage of them. And so that's something that I really appreciate about The Shining as well, is that these entities, these external forces in our lives cannot be, forgiven or treated as though they do not affect our internal lives and the more personal spheres of interaction that we have with other people. Um, And I think that that perhaps is something that has been showing up a lot in life now and life throughout the pandemic. One of the other aspects of life that I feel the need to really address in terms of pandemic life and just life in general, for myself at least, is this aspect of this boiler room ticking time bomb situation. And I think one of the things that we definitely saw come to a head that has been kind of working its way through the culture probably since around 2013, 2014, when the Black Lives Matter movement first really saw its start, was the murder of George Floyd. And I remember distinctly going out to protests in June and seeing the community uproar and just this demand that this stop. Um, and it breaks my heart terribly to think that it is just something that has really been so prevalent for so long, and finally there was just big outcry, and it wasn't only because of the brutal killing that took place and then the subsequent grief, but I think also these interactions were exacerbated by what was going on. People were homeless, people were unemployed, people were not getting the assistance that they needed, people were very unhappy, and I think that all of those triggers, along with seeing a video of someone being murdered in the streets in a way that maybe we haven't prior to in May when it occurred. Um, it's very heartbreaking, and so that's something that I also feel the need to address because it did take up a lot of my pandemic time and a lot of the self-improvement and the self-work that I think that needed to take place for myself and for a lot of people locally as well. As we know, in 2015, the Bakersfield Police Department was ruled one of the deadliest forces in the nation. And we haven't really seen too much improvement in terms of, statements let out by the Daily Mail, highlighting some statements from our own sheriff, and so I think that that's something that I was really obviously it's very sad to have to acknowledge that that's happening in your own community and have to reckon with, especially as someone who's very young and maybe doesn't feel like I have the authority to speak on it or the experience with which to combat this kind of racism institutionally. But I am glad in a lot of ways to see that this is something that the community wants. It's something that we are demanding, and so that's another thing that I really wanted to discuss. Because The Shining did make me think about so many things that were greatly, deeply saddening, but also kind of inevitable. And that's kind of where I want to leave this podcast. Um, I think overall, my experience with being locked down, being in quarantine, having gone through this very tumultuous time, is that I definitely value people in a way that maybe I didn't prior to, or didn't have the time to really slow down and acknowledge the relationships that are very important to me and acknowledge the people that I value in my life. And so that is definitely something that I take away with a lot of gratitude. And I hope that that same is true for you, and whoever you love in your life, whether that be family or friends or teachers or um, that your local barista. I just hope that we can all appreciate those that we love in our lives and all of those that we've yet to meet. So thank you for listening, and I really hope that you enjoyed. And we will take you out with some more of my father's sound stylings.